want to share with you that I've really enjoyed the times I've been able to be with you at chapel. It's been a special time for me to be able to be a part of this chapel. And I will say I much prefer to be sitting there as opposed to standing here. But I do appreciate your support and your encouragement and your prayers that makes it possible for me to stand. And even the prayers we had just preceding this are greatly appreciated by myself. Just before I came over here, former President Waybright was on the phone with Mindy, and she was sharing with him that I was going to the chapel and speaking there, and he says, well, it's always good to speak about sin and Jesus. And so I really highly value his counsel, his insight, his input, and I weighed that for a minute and say, well, should I switch my topic or should I kind of stay with what I was going to do before? And Mindy suggested I just stay with what I was going to talk about before. So I think her counsel is wise as well. So we're going to go with that. And the seeds of this talk were planted in my mind this summer. And when I mentioned at the convocation when I was with you at that time that our family had gone and had a weekend, Memorial Day weekend, with a preacher called Ray Vanderlaan. And he teaches in a school in Holland, Michigan, and so the students there call him RVL. And he takes a number of trips to Israel, and I've really enjoyed and appreciated his messages and that weekend that we had together. And during that weekend, he shared a thought with us that I had never heard before, and it's a rabbinic teaching. It says, you don't carry the ark carries you. And I think a lot of times we've read this passage, or we've thought about this passage, or we've seen renditions of this ark, and we really haven't given it too much thought about carrying this ark. But when you hear that describe what all the elements that were part of that ark, and how this ark was built out of wood and covered with gold, and have this cherubim, and have these tablets of stone placed inside that ark, you come to a new appreciation of, this would have been quite a heavy object that God had asked his people to carry it. And it doesn't really say in there how many people were carrying that ark. Traditionally, at least all the pictures I've seen have 4 people, 2 people on each side at the end of the pole. But obviously, whether it's 4 or some other larger number, and it also doesn't say how long those poles are. It indicates that those poles should never be removed from that ark. So the poles are there, people are there to carry the ark, and when you figure about this weight, I've seen some that would indicate it could have been up to 2,000 pounds, that this ark would be, how much it would weigh, with the contents and the everything about the ark itself. So you figure that out, and you'd say, hey, if you've had 4 people carrying the ark, that'd be like 500 pounds per person, which would be quite a heavy load for a person, particularly when you figure the terrain that they're carrying this ark over. You say, how would that be possible? And I think there's probably maybe 3 different options for how something that on its face would look impossible could be possible. So first of all, I think the first option would be that when God asks us to do something, he makes the possible, or he makes the impossible possible. And so when you looked at that and you'd said, how could that taken place? God could have given the strength to those people that he called to do that work, the ability to accomplish the task that he called for them. Second option could be that God makes the impossible possible, and he does it in a way that onlookers can really see that what's taking place. When I was looking around saying, well, how much this ark weighed, and I had indicated that, there's some accounts that say it's up to 2,000, but there's all sorts of different variations. But one of the accounts I saw that talked and showed a picture of the Levites carrying the ark kind of levitating across the ground. So they're almost like a hovercraft kind of going over the ground, the terrain. So if, in fact, that would fit into this kind of concept that you don't carry the ark carries you. In that concept, they were just kind of holding on to the pole, and God was making it happen. And that, is a possibility, that God makes it possible, and he makes that his supernaturally work possible for us to see as well. And so we can recognize that God is in it, and that supernatural working of God is very evident to us. A third option is that our initial sense and our initial reading of what this is and what's required to make this task possible is not what appears on the face. And I saw an account of a person who went through this ark on a very meticulous detail and saying, if we took the gold that was covering this ark and kind of looked at the purity of that gold and saying it probably wasn't as pure as pure gold, and therefore the weight of that gold that's over covering the ark would be less heavy, less dense, so that reduces down the weight. Let's say we have the wood that the ark was comprised of was thinner, so we reduce that down. And this person went through every element of this ark, including the tablets that were inserted inside the ark, and said if those tablets were thinner and smaller, we could have a much lighter ark. And so through his calculations, he came up with a number of 183 pounds. And so therefore, it'd only be about 46 pounds per person to carry the ark, which is more manageable. And I think sometimes we have that as something that we take into our account when we think of the impossible and saying, how could God make the impossible possible? Well, we kind of explain it away, and we say this is how it can be done, or how it could have been done. This is how God could have taken that very apparently impossible task and made it possible for them to accomplish it. And with your permission, I'd like to use a personal illustration, kind of telling you where I come out on these three options. And I'm going to need to start on my personal story going way back to my childhood. We were on a family vacation, and we went to one of those motels to stay overnight, and there was a swimming pool, small swimming pool outside the motel, and I was a small child, just had learned how to swim, I thought, and so I jumped in. I was swimming across this small pool, and unfortunately, partway across the pool, I started panicking as far as my ability to get to the other side, and I started floundering in the water, and that floundering was not helped by any means. When my sisters and my mother started yelling and screaming, that kind of added to my panic, and so I was going down and back and forth, and finally I made it to the other side, but that whole experience left this fear of water within me, very deeply held fear of water. And so after that time, my parents would send me to swim classes, and I'd go to these swim classes during the summertime. And the instructors would very quickly see that, saying, hey, you need to learn to relax. You need to learn to relax in the water and to be able to be more comfortable. But even though I knew that that's what I needed to do, the ability to do it was something that was difficult for me to internalize. So even though I kept trying, I wasn't too successful in learning how to swim. So then I came to Trinity here for school, and one of the physical education classes was a swimming class, and so I remember signing up again to try to conquer this inability to swim. And so I went to the swim classes, and I remember going on, they had Ford vans and brought us over to Deerfield High School, where we had our swim classes, and going to those swim classes and just working on swimming. And my recollection is it was always cold. The Getting in the van was cold, and getting into the van after the swim classes was always even colder. But kept at it, and I actually improved a bit on my swimming. I was helped by the fact that I was also ran on the cross-country team, so even though I couldn't do the strokes very efficiently, I could do them for a long time. And I completed that exercise and completed that course. A few years after this, I went to visit my sister in Zaire, and she was a missionary there, and I went on a visit to see her there, Zaire, and now it's called the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I flew into Bangui, and which was in the Central African Republic, which is just across the Bangui River from Zaire, where we were going. We went across the river and got on her motorcycle and took a 6-hour drive through the bush and through the jungle to the girls' boarding school that she was teaching at. And they were teaching in French at that boarding school, but the trade language in that area was Lingala. And in Lingala, to say hello in Lingala is Mbute. And so when we were driving through the area and through the countryside on this motorcycle, all the children would come out because they could hear us coming from long distances away. And they'd line the road that came through the villages, and they'd put an O on the end of Mbute. So they'd go Mbutio, and they would just be yelling that as we went through on our motorcycle. So it was kind of a fun event as we were getting into where she stayed and lived, because we had all these children waving at us, and we're driving down the road, and they're yelling in Butio, and we're waving back like we're on a Rose Bowl parade float or something. So it was a fun time, and we eventually get to the girls' boarding school, and I spent some time there. And one of the times, during the time we were there, we went on an excursion. And this excursion took us to a town called Mbengi, which was on the river separating Zaire from Central African Republic. And so they got all the girls into a large truck, and they had an open-ended back end to that truck, and everyone got in there and took the drive over to the river. Everyone was playing in the river, and they were having a good time when we were actually near the end of our time in that river. And then I noticed the girls were frantically yelling and screaming and pointing out into the river. And when I looked out there, I saw one of the girls had been caught up in a current, and she was struggling to stay above water. She was going up and down in the water. And so then I swam out to where she was at. And it was extremely difficult because you can appreciate the fact that she's panicking and scared, and she's pulling me down, and we're struggling to kind of help her into shore, but it was extremely challenging going back and forth. And there was a moment in time that I said, I don't think I'm going to make this. I don't think we're going to be successful getting back to shore, and if I'm going to be successful, I'm just going to need to leave her and get back on my own. But in that moment, just in that quick flash, made the determination, said, hey, I'm going to be here with her, and if she lives, I'll live. If she dies, I'll die. Our lives will be linked together. And it happens that quickly where you make those kind of decisions. But you can see by the fact that I'm here today, God was faithful to help through this. And so we were able to make it to shore together. And we got to the where we could walk and walk into shore. And then I looked out again to the river, and there was another person in the river floating past, and this person was face down, unconscious, and was just really a body floating down the river. So I went back out to the river, swam back out into the river, pulled that body, grabbed her, this body was totally unconscious, no fighting, but able to bring her back until we got to the point where we're able to walk. And I started walking, and then she came to, regained her consciousness, and threw up a huge amount of water. Huge amount of water just came out, flowing, gushing out of her mouth. And so after a period of time, we got everyone back on the truck, and we went to the mission in Nyberg. And we were sitting around there and got in touch with the hospital that is in the area, the mission hospital at Tandala. And they were talking to the doctors, and the doctors were very concerned about the life of this person, particularly the one that had taken in all this large quantity of water because of the contamination potential and the bacteria that would be consumed, and they were fearful about her being able to be able to live and be able to survive this. But by God's grace, she survived. Both of those girls survived, and they continued to were able to live without any ill effects. And in recounting this, one of those girls says, God brought Neil to Africa to save us. But when you think about it, you say, did I really save them? If it was left to my abilities, if it was left to my skills, if it left to my talent, there would have been 3 bodies floating down that river. So it's, in my mind, it was only by God, only by the grace of God, only by the power and strength of God that we were able to save those 2 lives. And my life was saved in that process as well. So when you think about what God asks of us and how God makes the impossible possible, I think there's some things that he would ask of us. And one, I think he would ask of us to be willing to give our most prized possession to himself. You think about Genesis 22, where God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and sacrifice him as a burnt offering. And I love Abraham's response. It says that he got up early the next morning and saddled his donkey in obedience to God. And I think that's what we need to do in our lives. We need to obey. Just as Abraham, he didn't delay, he obeyed and followed after him. And I think when God recounted saying, take your son, Isaac, your only son, the one you love, it just kind of reinforces that thought that God knew what he was asking of Abraham. He knew that this was something that was very special to Abraham, his only son, the one he loved. And yet God was asking to do this, and God then honored his obedience and helped see a way through what seemed like an impossible situation. I think it's important to kind of point out that it's not for us to determine what most prized possession we give to God. There's nothing we can do to ingratiate ourselves to God. There's nothing that we have that is of value to give to God. And we say, hey, God, now you're indebted to me. But when we have open hands and we say what we have and whatever we have, we give to you and allow you to use it as you choose, then I think there's a possibility for the impossible to become possible. I'm also thinking about how in Malachi 3, God says, give your whole tithe and bring them into the storehouse. And then he will pour out so much blessing that you will not be able to have room enough to store it. God asks us to give our most prized possession, give of what we have, all that he's given to us. And in Romans 12, it also talks about how God asks us to give of ourselves. give of ourselves as a living sacrifice and offer our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. And as you know, there's one problem with living sacrifices, and that is that they have a tendency to crawl them back off the altar at every opportunity. And I think it's important for us to give our lives as living sacrifices and that are committed to staying at the altar, that are committed to doing what God calls us to do, no matter how difficult it may appear to be, no matter how uncertain that future may appear to be, no matter how challenging the road is ahead of us, that we put ourselves on the altar and we stay on the altar. And then he can do some amazing things through our lives. When we give all that we have, when we give all that we owned and all that we are to him, that's when I think God can work and do amazing things through our lives. So remember the ark? You can't carry the ark carries you. I think if you were able to go back in time and ask one of those men after a long day of carrying the ark, and you went up to them and said, "How did you do that?" I believe, with sweat dripping down their face, I believe they would have said, "We didn't carry the ark. The ark carried us. God made it possible." So here's the word of the Lord from the book of Exodus that God told Moses to tell the people of Israel. "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself.